Well, let's jump forward a little bit, because talking about the Archibald Prize, you have been a finalist 15 times, but not only that, you've also twice won the Packing Room Prize and twice won People's Choice for the Roy and H, fantastic Roy and H.G. painting, which actually is in the Archie 100, travelling around the country, and is a much-loved painting, I've got to say. What's that whole experience? I mean, you did finally become a finalist. What was that like when the first time that you...
It was a dream come true, really. I had painted John, speaking of Roy and H.G., I had painted John Doyle, Roy Slavin. Prior to that, just by himself, was a portrait of John as an Archibald entry, because I would listen to him on 2BL in the afternoons, the radio program, while I was illustrating. And from 2 till 4 on the ABC every afternoon, and he was, I was fascinated by him as a person. So I approached him, and he agreed for me to paint him. And it didn't get into the Archibald proper, but was a finalist. It was in the Salon de Refusé exhibition, and it was quite popular there. And so I had that in the back of my mind. I thought it would be nice to paint the pair of them together at some point, but I let that idea go.
I should just mention, for people who aren't from Australia, who Roy and HG are, they're like when they're together, they're like this comedic duo. They were sports commentators together. Yeah. They're very, very funny, and nearly all Australians would know who they were back in those days.
Exactly.
And they did this great commentary of the 2000 Olympics.
They were the icing on the cake of the Olympic broadcast.
They were, yeah.
So I thought now's the time to paint them, and again they happily agreed. I remember sitting in, while they were doing This Sporting Life, which was their afternoon program on the weekends at Triple J, and I was sitting there in the studio while they were going live to air, sketching them, and then I photographed them as well later on, and then produced this portrait, which, funnily enough, at the time I wasn't at all happy with, and I nearly didn't enter it because I just felt, I don't know what it was. There was something about the composition that just troubled me, and it may have been that I was just becoming fixated because I'd been working on it for about a month. First another version, which later I turned into just a portrait of HG, which is at Macquarie University these days, and then the version that I finally entered.
Which is, I should just briefly explain for people who are listening who can't get to their phones, it's HG, who's Greg Pickhaver, is in the front, in the foreground, and John Doyle is just behind him, slightly behind him.
And John was always, every time I saw John, he was always wearing a T-shirt. So I had to have him wearing the T-shirt. But I added a little bit to the T-shirt. I included Fatso, that was their unofficial mascot for the Olympics, Fatso
the wombat. That's right.
The fat so-and-so wombat.
And so what do you think it was about the portrait that you think it's just you were working on it for so long that you just couldn't see the fresh anymore? What sort of bothered you about it?
I remember showing a gallery director friend of mine as I was going to the art gallery, and I said, look, I really don't know about this. I'm not too sure. And he said, I don't think it's okay. I wouldn't feel any qualms about entering it. So I thought, okay, well, maybe I should. But I was very sheepish about it. I kind of had it under wraps, and I had something draped over it so people wouldn't see it. But when I got it to the gallery, the media were there, and a gust of wind caught this drape, lifted it up, and then someone noticed who it was. And of course, Roy and HG were very popular at the time. And so, Roy and HG, can we get a picture? And I thought, okay, the game's up. I went along with it from that point. And but I didn't know if it would get in, because getting into the Archibald is the tough part. Getting anything beyond that is icing on the cake. But just getting hung is such a challenge. So when I did hear that it got hung, I was tickled pink, of course, and I was in the media scrum in there to hear who would win that year. It wasn't me, but Steve Peters, the chief packer, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Paul, you've won the Packers Prize, the Packing Room Prize." And I said, "Oh, that's great. What's the Packing Room Prize?" It wasn't known back then. This was This was 2001. Now it's like almost as famous as the Archibald proper, but back then it was just something that someone thought up, on the back of an envelope, and it seemed like a good idea at the time, and but it wasn't well known, so I didn't know what it was, and I think it was $500 and a pat on the back. That was.
Oh, and it didn't get in the papers or anything back then.
Actually it did. And I think because of the subject, Roy and HG were just so big. In fact, Greg said to me later, because it was the front page, it got enormous publicity. It was on the front page of all the newspapers as the Packing Prize winner. And Greg said to me, this is unsustainable, this level of publicity surrounding. I think he was talking about the Archibald more generally, but specifically this portrait of him and John. He said it's hard to imagine that this could perpetuate, that this level of publicity could continue. And then later, when it got the People's Choice Award, it started again, and which was wonderful for me. I mean, but I have no illusions that the reason it was so popular was the subject.
Oh,
I mean, hopefully I portrayed
that.
them in a sympathetic manner. And I think I also, having Greg forward and John back, was the way they'd often perform. So it seemed to ring true. And initially I had John in front and Greg behind. That was the earlier version, and it just didn't work. It just didn't feel right. But when I put Greg in front, and I explained that to them, and he said, yeah, that's how it is for us as well. He said, for some reason, and he said this without a trace of ego, he said, for some reason when I'm out front and John's behind, that visual dynamic seems to work for them.
Well, can we talk about another painting? And it's actually we're going to talk about two paintings, very important paintings, and one of them is behind you, and they are portraits of the fabulous Maggie Tabberer, who is a fashion publishing and media personality and just a very elegant, beautiful woman, and is very well known in Australia. And the interesting thing about these two portraits, well, there's lots of interesting things about them, but they were painted 21 years apart.
Yeah.
And this portrait that's behind you was in the 2020 Archibald, and the other one was in the 1999 Archibald. And I think this is one of the first paintings. The 1999 painting was probably the first time I noticed your work. And I remember that painting. And also the Campisi painting, that was another one that I remember I was really struck by. I remember really studying that one because I was so, blown away by how lifelike and beautiful it was. But anyway, that's digressing.
Thank you.
So can you tell me a little bit about these two works?
So Maggie I approached at the time back in 99 or just prior to that. I think it was that year that I first approached her. She'd just come out with a tell-all autobiography, which was a great success commercially. And Maggie, I read the book and it struck me, and I'd grown up with seeing Maggie on TV as a kid when I was a young bloke. She struck me as someone who is, the elder stateswoman of fashion and someone who was very beautiful and elegant and strong, and I thought would make a fabulous, and particularly because she came up with that book, she was flavour of the month at that point, and I thought, again, I do like to try and paint someone who's topical when I choose a subject or approach a subject for the Archibald. And when I started working with her, as I often do, I started by taking a whole lot of photos of her in different arrangements, different scenarios, indoors, outdoors, under an oak tree with her dog, a whole plethora of different options. And I finally decided, this is cutting a long story very short, on a very simple composition, very simple pose, because she struck me as someone who had such a presence. And in all the photos I took of her and drawings I was doing at the time and little colour studies, she had such a strength and such a presence that she needed nothing else in the painting, in the composition, to support her visually.
And what proportion of works do you think you've already thought, this is the way I'm going to do it before the photo shoot, as opposed to thinking, oh, wait a second, I'm learning more about this person while I'm doing it?
I always come along with some idea of how I might like to compose the picture, but I hold it very lightly because I know that almost invariably, out of left field, a great idea that I couldn't have anticipated will emerge. And that happens almost invariably. And with commission work as well, which is one of the reasons why I like to start by photographing the person and just all kinds of different things that maybe I don't think are going to work, or the person themselves is not necessarily that comfortable doing. I mean, I don't do things that they're uncomfortable with, but just, out of their comfort zone a little bit.
Why would you do that?
Because sometimes these things emerge when you weren't expecting them. And unless you try and stretch the boundaries a little bit, it's going to be very safe. And it's always better if it's not too safe, I think. And you can always reject that idea. If it ends up being a dud idea, you go, well, okay, well, we're not going to go down that path. But you've tried it, and then you can at least dispense with it, having tried it. There's nothing worse, I think, than at the end of the exercise thinking, gee, if only I'd done this, or if only I'd tried that. I like to try everything to begin with.
So do you mean, when you say everything, you mean seated, standing, all different poses?
Yeah, indoors, outdoors, an angle that I might not have thought originally. In the case of like with Hugh and Deb, different configurations of their pairing, laying down on the ground, standing up. We tried a whole range of different things.
Well, you know what else I find interesting and I'm curious about is, how do you relax the person so that you're getting the right expression? Or how do you know when it's the right expression?
Well, for me, the photography, for many years I didn't own a camera when I was at art school and for years after that. So I became very familiar with painting from life, only from life, and drawing from life. And I think that was a really good a really good way to learn, because when I did start to use a camera, I was very aware of the lies that photos can tell you. And you've got to learn, as a young illustrator as I was then, to ignore a lot of what is in the photo, because it's just not what you would see. The colours may be washed out, or the proportions may be exaggerated because of the lens of the camera. If you're too close to the subject, the front of the face, the nose and the lips may be enlarged abnormally. It's continually a process of referring back to life. And so I usually, when I can, when the person has sufficient time for me, do a life study as well, an oil study, just of them sitting for me after I've taken photos. And the photos give me an idea of what sort of composition I might go with, and also give them an idea of how I'm seeing them. The main purpose for that exercise is for me to really study them carefully on a ongoing basis for a couple of hours.
And do you often then have them come back at the end?
Yeah. Again, if it's an overseas client, it can be a bit tricky, but if I can, I do.